Get ready for a little atmospheric magic. In this presentation, we're going to turn day into night, then night into a beautiful sunset. We're going to do this by transforming the shape of these clouds into perspective and creating a sophisticated, advanced mask of the skyline so that the clouds seem to go into the distance and behind the mountains. We're also going to apply a layer style to these clouds to give the illusion of this sunset casting its light off the edges of these clouds. Let's get started. I'm going to throw away the two layers that are used to create this effect. As always, it's wonderful to do things the simple way with as few layers as possible. Let's start here with this single layer and this image of this desert. The first thing we need to do is to create a mask of the sky where the clouds will appear. There are a couple ways to do this. One of them is with the magic wand tool. Another one is with the select and the color range tool. However, neither one of these is as accurate or as professional as using one of the existing channels from your image to generate a mask. Let's take a look. Over here in the Channels palette, clicking on this tab, let's take a look at the red channel, the green, and the blue. Now you decide which one has the greatest amount of contrast that we could work with as a basis for a mask. The hint is, it's the blue. You simply drag this down to the base of the Channels palette over this icon, drop it, and it copies it. Remember, you do not want to work on the original blue channel, or you would change the colors in your image. Now with this copy, I'm going to show you a technique I use to create this mask. This is the mask I ended up with when I was done. But let's generate this from this image. Targeting this image in the Channels palette, let's move over here to the tools we find here, the Dodge tool and the Burn tool. Let's start with the Dodge tool. Now the Dodge tool, when set to dodge highlights, will then eliminate and dodge the highlights out of the lighter regions of this image. Now remember, our goal is to have a white sky and a black foreground to create a really nice mask that separates the sky from the mountains. Now, with this set, of course, here to dodge highlights and an exposure of 50%, watch what happens as I go through here. I think you can see this. It is dodging away the light highlight shades within this image. I can come up to the edge of the mountain and clean up some of the clouds there and continue on through until I've eliminated all the pixels within the sky. Now let's try this other tool. Click and hold and select the Burn tool. This time, again in the options bar, we're going to select the range. And that's the beauty of using this technique, because you have a range of shades you can target and either dodge or burn. In this case, we want to burn the shadows. Let's move down in here, and I'm start to brush over the surface. I'm burning not only shadows, but some mid-tone values as well. I'm clicking multiple times and moving over the surface. Notice how nicely it avoids the highlights that we dodged out earlier. I can get a really nice, refined edge to these mountains. In fact, you can get some much more subtle shades of transition with this technique than you can with color range or with the magic wand tool. Instantly, I'm done. We have a perfect mask. We're going to store this away and come back to this later. Now we want to create our clouds. I'm going to do that here in the Channels palette. I'm going down here to the base and click Create New Channel. Then, glancing over to make sure I have black and white for my foreground and background colors, I'm going to go up here to Filter and down to Render and over to clouds. Here are clouds. Now, I could have built these clouds as a layer, but the technique I'm using requires that I generate transparency in my clouds. So I'm building them in the channels palette, and then I'm going to load them as a selection. It sounds complex, but let's give this a try. Follow along. We know that a grayscale image is a mask. The highlights would represent one level of selection, and the shadows would represent another level of selection. If I move over here in the channels palette and put my cursor over alpha channel 3, then hold down the command key on the Macintosh or the control key on the PC and click, I then load this as a selection. The grayscale as a selection. A little complex, but let's give this a try. Let's go back over to our RGB image here, then over to layers, and then let's create a new layer to put our clouds into. Click here. Now, my current foreground color is black, and I have a selection based upon the grayscale values found in our cloud. What happens when we flood this selection with black? Let's give it a try. With the Option or Alt key selected, targeting layer number 1, I'm going to select the Delete key. So Option or Alt and the Delete key will flood the current selection with the current foreground color. Bingo. So we now have what looks like smoke, but our clouds are here on this layer with transparency. Let's deselect this. Under Select, Deselect. I'll prove that there's transparency by clicking on the visibility for the background layer here so we can see through it. You see the checkerboard? I can only achieve this through loading the channel as a selection and then flooding it with color. Okay, let's get moving. For now, we need to distort and transform these clouds so that they have perspective. Let's start by going back to our channels palette and loading the alpha channel. Remember the blue channel we made earlier with the Dodge and Burn tool? Let's load that as a selection. So with the Command key or the Control key, of course the Command key on the Macintosh, the Control key on the PC, the icon changes. I click on the blue copy and it is loaded as a selection. A perfect, wonderful selection. I must say so myself. Back to the RGB image, clicking here, back to layers, and then target layer number 1, which is our clouds. Now here we go. Remember, we want the clouds to appear in the sky only. So if we move down here to the base of the layers palette and add a layer mask based upon the selection, poof, clicking it, we now have a mask which isolates the clouds in the sky. But the clouds have no perspective. This is where the transformation tool comes into play. But before we transform the clouds, we must split the clouds from the mask. Here, between the two, is this link. I'm going to click on it so they're no longer linked, and if I distort one, it will not distort the other. Let's prove this. I'm going to target the image of the clouds. Watch as the icon changes when I click on the thumbnail. Did you see the icon here? It's turned into a brush icon, which indicates I'm working on the clouds and the image and not the mask. Next, select my magnifying glass. Move into my image area and hold down my Option or Alt key to change my magnifying glass into a minus sign. Click once, click twice. That's perfect, giving myself some area in which to work in. Next, let's move up to the Edit menu and down to Transform and over to Perspective. We're going to adjust the perspective of the clouds. Grabbing the corner here, I can simply move off to the right to expand the perspective like this. I'm going to go out to about that level. Then I'm going to move in here, and I'm going to grab the base and move it in like this. Then let's go back up to Edit, down to Transform, and over to Scale. In this case, I'm going to move this element up like this until I come fairly close to the edge of the mountain range. That looks great, but I think we need to adjust the perspective just a little bit more. Back up to the Edit menu, down to Transform, and over to Perspective. Now I can grab here, this lower right-hand corner, and move this back over, just like this. And let's move the top back out a little bit like that. Let's get a really nice extreme angle happening, so I get the perspective of the clouds matching the perspective of my image. Every image is slightly different, so the adjustments you make should be made to correspond to your image. I'm now going to hit my Enter key. It then resolves this transformation down into the image. Now this looks pretty ugly, but we're going to make it look better very quickly. Let's zoom in on this, clicking once, clicking twice, so we can see the image here. We're starting to see that perspective of the clouds happening. A little bit larger up here, a little bit smaller back here. Now, what we want to add next is the layer style. I've created some special layer styles already, and we're going to apply them and then analyze what I've done. And for those who are interested, I'm going to place these layer styles in the same location that you will locate this fine movie, either on my website or on a CD. So, now let's move over here to the Styles palette and target the Styles palette here. You'll notice in the Styles palette I have something called Sunset and Sunrise and Morning Frost from a previous demo. In this case, I'm going to target the sunset. But first, I want to make sure that my layer number 1 is targeted, as you see here. I'm then going to apply a style to this, and then we'll analyze what's going on. I'm merely going to click on the sunset cloud style, and let's see what happens. Unbelievable! I've applied this simple style to this layer to create this effect. Let's analyze what's going on here. As you cast your eyes up here into the layers palette, you notice that there is a gradient overlay, a bevel emboss, and a drop shadow. It's the combination of these three effects that give this illusion. Let's turn them on one by one so you can see the effects that happen. Here is the gradient overlay. And here is the bevel emboss that's added to it. And then finally the drop shadow, which then casts a shadow over the mountains. Let's double click here on gradient overlay and see what this is made of. Moving this over to the right, we can see this more clearly. The gradient overlay, if I click here, indicates that I've created a gradient of a dark purple that gradates to a light purple. This gradient is then overlaying itself onto the clouds and giving us the illusion of depth, darker in the distance and lighter in the foreground. You can experiment and create different gradients across your clouds for different effects. Let's take a look at the bevel emboss. The bevel emboss gives it depth and structure to the clouds, as well as a color, the color of the sunrise. You can see here that I've selected a shadow mode set to a color dodge setting, and I've selected a bright red. Notice, as I move through this, I can change the shade and color of the highlights on the clouds simply and easily by moving through the selection of colors in this palette. Let's cancel from that and now take a look at the drop shadow. The drop shadow simply places a dark cast of light over my image to give the illusion of nighttime. You can notice that I've set it to a soft light mode. Let's click Cancel from this, and let's enhance this to its final step. Remember that soft light mode gave us a really nice dark value of a nighttime scene. I'm going to create a new layer here from the base of my layers palette. I'm going to move it down here just above the background by clicking and dragging it down to this position. Then I'm going to flood this with black. Remember the technique we used before? We had a selection. In this case, we have no selection, and if we hold down the Option or Alt key and select the Delete key, it's going to flood this layer with the current foreground color, simply and easily with the Option or Alt key and the Delete key, just like that. Now, remember that setting of soft light? Target this layer, go up to the Mode adjustments here, and down to Soft Light. Watch this. So now we have a really nice dark quality to our image, enhancing our sky. Let's see this before and then after. It gives it that final touch to make it look like a sunset. Now, let's take a look at something else. Let's turn this off. Let's target the clouds we created earlier. And now let's look at a variation that we can achieve with the same layer but with different settings to the layer styles. Moving down here to my Styles palette, I'm going to click on Sunrise Cloud Style. Same layer, different settings. Click on it. And now we have what appears to be a sunrise. Amazing. Let's see what that looks like with that additional darkened layer here. Fantastic. So, through the combination of layer styles on these distorted clouds, we can create all sorts of different moods and atmospheric conditions from a simple photograph. We started with something as simple as this and ended up with this. Give these techniques a try the next time you want to achieve some atmospheric illusions. Don't forget, if you'd like to use these same styles for your project, simply acquire them from the CD containing this movie or from Mr. Brown's website, and then load them by going to the flyout arrow here from the Styles palette, and then over to Load Styles. Locate them and load them into your set. Then merely target the layer that you'd like to place the style on and select it from the Styles palette. There you have it. Give it a try.